And good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Community Development Scrutiny Committee. My name is Councillor Diana Garrett and I will be chairing the meeting this evening. Members, please can I remind you that this meeting is being broadcast to the public via the Council's YouTube channel. And before I begin with the main meeting, I would just like to highlight that this meeting marks our first in-person meeting since early 2020. As we move through the meeting, please can I remind everyone present to turn off their microphones when you have finished speaking. I would also like to welcome our guests very briefly, and these are two officers from Essex County Council's Sustainable Transport team, Tracy Vickers, Head of Sustainable Transport, and Chris Radley, Cycling Strategy Lead, and we will hear from these two people later in the meeting. So I'll now proceed with the business of the meeting. Agenda item 1, apologies for absence. We have three members who have apologised for their absence this evening. Councillor Mrs Dervish, Councillor Corsina and Councillor Mrs Pell.
Chairman, there's no further apologies.
Thank you. Then I will proceed to agenda item 2, which is the declarations of interest. Members, do I have any disclosable pecuniary interest or other pecuniary interest or non-pecuniary interest that anyone may wish to declare this evening? No? Thank you very much. I will then proceed to agenda item 3, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. Please can I have a proposer to approve the minutes as an accurate record of the previous meeting of the Community Development Scrutiny Committee held on the 23rd of June 2021. Thank you, Councillor Wright and Councillor Hensman. So the minutes have been moved and seconded as an accurate record. All of those in favour, would you please indicate? Thank you very much. Everybody, that's unanimous, thank you. Minutes are approved. Public question time. Members, I believe that there are no registered speakers this evening for this evening's meeting. So we will then proceed with agenda item 5, which is our scrutiny review into cycling and walking. And this is our third evidence gathering session. Members, for this item, I'm pleased to advise that we have our two officers that I've previously mentioned in attendance with us this evening, Tracy Vickers, Head of Sustainable Transport, and Chris Radley, Cycling Strategy Lead. I'd like to start by welcoming both Tracy and Chris to the meeting. They very kindly agreed to attend as part of our third evidence gathering session for this review. Tracy and Chris, could I please invite you to begin with your presentations? If easier for you both, please feel free to take questions from members at the end. So, thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Chair and members, for inviting us here today. As introduced, my name is Tracy Vickers. I'm Head of Sustainable Transport for Essex County Council, and that covers walking and cycling, which we'll focus on today, but it also includes all aspects of sustainable transport. So it does include electrification on alternative fuels. It does include things like e-scooters. It also includes bus in a roundabout way, although we obviously have a head of passenger transport, but we very much view bus as part of the solution. So really anything that helps Essex become safer, greener and healthier in terms of transport is part of my remit. So what I will do today, very briefly, before I hand over to Chris, who is the cycling expert, is just talk you through in a very few slides about some of the aspirations we have at an Essex County Council level that I hope will resonate with you all, and then talk through some specific government initiatives around active travel and the promotion of, and what Essex County Council are doing to support that. Okay, next slide please. So earlier this year, Essex County Council agreed a new vision for sustainable transport, actually for all transport, because it doesn't matter whether we're talking about highways, whether we're talking about cycling, whether we're talking about walking, or even whether we're talking about building a new bridge. We want it to be safer, greener and healthier for everybody. So you'll hear Chris and I probably reference safer, greener and healthier a lot, but that is our ambition. But from a sustainable transport point of view, next slide please, we want to do a whole lot more. And we need to do this, and I'll come on to why shortly, but just to explain what we mean about sustainable transport in this instance. It's not about penalising the car and car drivers, but it is a moral issue. It's making sure that everybody has access to a number of different ways of travelling that work for them. It's about providing choice. So we view it very much as providing choice, not about building more roads or building more cycling infrastructure, although of course we want to do aspects of the latter. We want to enable active travel and make it the default, because if we're going to achieve our climate commitments, we have to start doing things differently. We're going to do this by focusing on active travel, but also thinking much more around solutions for everyone. So I put sustainable corridors up there, and what I mean by that is we no longer propose to just build roads for tin boxes. We want to build sustainable travel corridors that cater to everybody. And just a reference to the carbon zero aspirations. And earlier today I was at GridServe for the COP26 battle bus and showcasing some of our recent active travel interventions. Next slide, please. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, so I won't labour it, but this is why it is so important. There's health impacts, there's economic impacts, there's physical and mental health impacts, and everything we do within sustainable transport is designed to do one of three things. We want to avoid travel where it's not necessary. The best sustainable transport is staying home. We want to shift people onto more sustainable transport where they have that option, walking, cycling, car share, public transport. And where that's not possible, because it's not always going to be possible, this is a rural county, cars will always be part of the solution. We have to improve them. We have to improve the technology around it, be that electrification, or improve the quality of our passenger transport. So it's the avoid, shift, improve. Thank you. Next slide. And this is at a more pragmatic level, perhaps, of why sustainable transport is important for individuals and communities. As I've said, physical and mental health. We want to see quieter streets that are safer for people to walk and cycle on, for kids to play in. Improved public realm that starts to create a sense of community and brings back that feeling of a neighbourhood with local stores and local shops. If we get more people walking and cycling who can, not everybody can, let's be clear, this is about enabling choice. We reduce congestion and we prioritise those people who don't have the option of active travel. This is just the start, however. This is a blueprint for what we want to do going forward, and we have really bold aspirations to make Essex a forefront of walking and cycling. A couple of years ago we held an important cycling conference, and all the tragic things that have happened with COVID have really meant that there's a spotlight on how we can do things differently. And coupled with all the climate challenges we have, now is such a good time to start asking these questions. Next slide, please. You'll probably know some of this, but I was specifically asked to cover off what's the government doing to support increased walking and cycling. I haven't covered off everything, but these are just a few key examples. So crucially, they've increased funding, and this is brilliant because nothing says you mean business by having the pound signs to follow it. They've specified that this increased funding is for high quality cycle lanes, and we'll talk a bit more about the quality aspect later, walking schemes and improvements to the national cycle network. These are really important, not just because of the power of a central government message about these things. It's also, as I said, putting the funding behind renovating, upgrading some frankly quite old infrastructure. And there's no point having a cycle route or a walking route if it's actually not fit for purpose. The other interesting recent development came out last week or the week before is the update to the Highway Code. And this is a recognition that we need to make walking and cycling ever safer, especially as numbers increase. So this looks at creating a road user hierarchy that says the people or the user group that can cause the most damage is responsible, has the greatest responsibility for reducing that damage, which puts a lot of emphasis on good car driving behaviour as well as understanding the rules of the road for everybody. It's strengthening pedestrian priority, and really quite crucially, because this is sometimes where accidents happen, giving cyclists priority at junctions. What's on there as network management duty guidance, doesn't mean anything to anybody, is the government's very new guidance that says if you're going to put in walking and cycling schemes, you need to give them time to bed in and for people to get used to them, because change is hard. If it wasn't, we'd have done all this already. We'd have solved climate change and everyone would be travelling actively or driving an electronic vehicle. But this is important because it recognises the difficulty in sometimes introducing bold new schemes and the inevitability that not everybody is going to like those. And sometimes there will be backlash. So what the government guidance is now saying is if we are paying for it, you have to prove that you have given it time to work, essentially. And if you pull that scheme too quickly, which some you've probably seen in the news, almost like a panic reaction at the backlash, have done, that jeopardises future funding. And this is really important because it gives councils, whether that's a district or county, a bit more strength, perhaps, and a bit more of a solid basis on which to approach these, because we can justify the why very easily, but it's usually a moral argument. The financial argument is important too, but it's not the only one. Gear change and LTN were the pivotal reports and guidance that came out last year, and this has transformed how people think about walking and cycling. Chris will probably go into this in a bit more detail, and I've got a slide a bit later. But what it does, crucially, is sets out the government's ambitions to triple cycling or whatever it is. But more importantly, it says, and this is what the cycling infrastructure needs to look like. It cannot just be a white line painted 30 centimetres out from the curb, and you call that quality cycling infrastructure. It has to be high quality, fit for purpose, if we are going to get people using it as a credible alternative. And I threw the last one in just because I think it's a very interesting one for districts to pursue. One of the things that it's less about the active travel side of walking and cycling, but more of the sustainable approach, is the number of delivery vehicles on our roads, and that is only increasing. But if we can start to think about deliveries differently, not everything needs to be another vehicle coming into a town centre, but having distribution hubs, which e-cargo bikes then deliver to homes and businesses, that takes a lot of vehicles off the road and is a really sustainable solution. At the moment, the government are offering a grant to businesses to buy e-cargo bikes, a bit like the grant for electric cars. And if you're thinking of just the small ice cream style one with the little trailer on the front, those are certainly available. But there's also much bigger ones. They have actually recently done a test in a supermarket in London, and they managed to do all the deliveries that a normal van would have done with one cargo bike. And so I think this is something we can all explore, and it's on our agenda to do so as well. I'm simply flagging it because the grant not most people aren't aware of. Next slide, please. Ooh, the pictures aren't very clear, but hopefully you can get a sense from the printout. I just wanted to give you some visual examples of what this improved cycling infrastructure might look like. So it's about reallocating walking, it's about reallocating space from other modes, typically the car. It's making sure these routes are segregated, and it's ideally segregated from pedestrians, between pedestrians and cyclists, but equally important, more importantly, segregation from motor traffic. Chris talks a bit later about some of the barriers to cycling and concern about traffic and volumes and safety on the road really is one of them. Next slide, please. This is a little bit more detail about what the LTN, so local transport note, but this is, if we'll talk about LTN 120, this is the pivotal guidance issued by the government, which says this is their key 5 criteria. Networks should be coherent, direct, safe, comfortable and attractive. And those are the 5 points that underpin and will underpin everything that we're doing going forward. So I've covered off the segregation bit, and we've covered off the highway schemes. So this is another interesting example that they will expect councils to demonstrate this going forward. So an example, I'm also responsible for the Army and Navy junction in Chelmsford. You may ask why. Well, it comes back to my previous points about sustainable corridors. We're not just going to build another road junction for cars. So when we got the plans, we actually said, no, this doesn't meet the LTN 120 guidance. We're not just building this for roads. We need to have dedicated walking and cycling routes into the town centre that are safe for people to use. Another crucial thing is the point about cosmetic interventions, and that's my point about white lines. And that is sadly how it's been done in the past, because it's cheap, it's quick, it's easy, but it doesn't meet the safety standards that are demanded anymore. Next slide, please. Right, so that's what the government's doing. I was also asked just to talk briefly about what ECC are doing on this. Now, this is just, again, some examples, some of which you will know about, some of which you may not. Cycling strategies on there, and I know Braintree have just concluded yours. Chris will talk more about Essex's cycling strategy, but our aspiration for cycling, for walking, and we have a walking strategy as well, reiterates what I have said already and will keep saying. It's to make it safer, greener, healthier. It's about providing choice. The other thing we do is simple things. I say simple, but often those that are perceived as simple that aren't. We do the cycling maps. So there is a Braintree and Whitton one, but those haven't been refreshed for a while. So one thing Chris and I will be working on over the next year or so is updating all the maps, because we've got suddenly all these people excited about walking and cycling and going, oh, well, where can I go? So we want to have these maps available in libraries, but also to download. You can have it in a PDF on your smartphone. I'm also responsible for the Community Rail Partnership, which looks after the branch line. So the Flitch line is one of those, and the reason why we call it a community rail line, for those that don't know, is they often have station adopters. So that's members of the local community that really want to drive patronage and make those stations feel accommodating and friendly and nice places to be. If you're in a nice environment whilst you're waiting for your train, it's much nicer than in some, soulless cabin or something. So they will do things like planters or improving walking and cycling. And what they've done recently, which is what's up there, is they produced a series of walks all around our... Sorry, did you have a question?
No. I'm just leading one of the walks on the community rail. Yes, you're looking
fabulous.
At the leader of the walk.
Okay, so you can probably say even more about it than I can. So we have those all around the county, and they're proving very popular. We have Cake Escape there. I don't know if anyone's heard that. That's a cycling loyalty scheme that combines cake and cycling, which I think is phenomenal. You go to a participating cafe, show them your card, well, buy a coffee, collect a loyalty stamp, and when you've collected a certain amount of loyalty stamps, you get free cake. And I checked, have several cafes in the scheme in the Braintree district, but we can always do more, particularly, I think, on key cycling routes like the Flitch Way. Love to Ride and Go Jointly are our partnerships with a cycling group and a walking group to learn more about the routes in your local, the routes in the networks in your local district, but also build a sense of community. So on Love to Ride, you can have little competitions with your neighbours or your friends. It monitors your progress, and if it notices you haven't cycled for a bit, it encourages you. It's not like Strava, which is much more competitive. This is much more fun and designed to get perhaps the casual walker and cycler, rather than necessarily someone who cycles every day, more active. Next slide, please. So in addition to doing all of those things and making sure, crucially, that anything we do going forward is LTN 120 compliant, this is a Braintree-specific scheme that we are finalising, fingers crossed, at the moment. Hopefully you are aware of it. It's been developed with local members and local officers. ATF is Active Travel Fund, and this was money the government gave us in November last year to improve walking and cycling in 5 locations. The districts actually nominated the routes, and Chris did some magic based on the DFT's criteria of how they analysed the routes, and 5 were prioritised out of something like, was it 26?
Scheme Statesville.
Yeah, something like
50, I think.
Was it? Oh, crikey,
Yeah,
50.
yeah.
And we had 5, so we have these 2 really in Braintree, Brentwood, Wickford, Chelmsford and Colchester. And the aim of all of them is to make walking and cycling easier for local residents. They do need to be transformational. You can't just do white lines. It has to be, because it's funded by central government, it needs to meet those LTN quality standards. But we'd want to. We're not using LTN as an excuse. We want to put in high quality infrastructure that makes people feel safe, that makes them excited to get out on their bikes. And Councillor Bentley, the leader at Essex, is really bold and aspirational about this and says he's okay with some people perhaps sitting in traffic for a few extra seconds watching a happy cyclist ride by if it means maybe they think, did I need to travel today? If I did, okay, but somebody in that line of traffic perhaps didn't need to travel by car that day. We can talk more about this proposal if you want. My point in showing it is that Braintree will be the recipient of this active travel fund money, and that's hugely important because it's part of building a longer term story, a longer term ambition, and Chris will talk about LC whips a little bit later. This is an LC whip route. That's the building blocks, if you will, of how the Department for Transport want to build their network, want to build the cycling networks across the country. And if you have a solid LC whip plan, you will be not prioritised, but that is what they consider when they're allocating the funding. So the next round that's just gone in was specifically designed to help districts that didn't have this coordinated cycling strategy in place develop them, and they have specifically said that those with an LC whip will help for future funding rounds. So all of this is starting to bring itself to tie. You know what I mean. Everything is a perfect happy storm of government funding, public aspiration, a real change in how people are living their lives, and we just have to be bold and really brave about what we want to do, because these changes aren't easy, as I've said, and some of them are controversial. Next slide, please. So, e-scooters. I was also asked to tackle this. This is also under my remit. This is, for those who don't know, a DFT DFT-led trial. Only hire scooters that have been safety assessed by the DFT in named locations by approved providers are legal. It doesn't matter, well it does, it doesn't matter what you see on the roads, unless they are, in Essex, an orange scooter that says spin on it, they are illegal, can be seized as an illegal vehicle by the police. We've done this trial in 6 locations, and we did it for all the reasons I've talked about already, to provide choice. It won't be for everybody, although we've got a tremendous age range of people using it. It's not just for teenage boys, as some people think, a whole range of different age groups. And we did it to provide choice. This is, net zero. It's an alternative to maybe the bus, maybe cycling. One day you might walk, the next day you might take the car, the next day you might take the train. It's about a portfolio of options. It's operating in Braintree, but you may not have seen many, because in Braintree we decided, with the support of members and officers, to trial a slightly different model. So all the others operate on a Boris bike style. So you hire it for 10 minutes, whatever it is. 20 minutes, you scoot from home to the station. In Braintree, we're doing longer term hire, so people are using it for a month. And for that reason, we think usage is quite low in Braintree compared to the others. We've only got 14 members using it in Braintree compared to 37,000 across the rest of Essex, which equates to something like taking 10 cars off the road for a year. We've done some of the CO2 calculations. That trial is due to end. It was going to be October this year. It's now due to end March next year. And then it needs to go to Parliament, where the Houses will decide whether to legalise it or not. Personally, this is very much my personal view, I think they will. I think the cart horse has bolted somewhat on that. But another reason why we were so keen to be involved in the trial is it's much easier to influence the debate and shape what the future legislation might look like if you are part of that trial, if you're sitting at the table. We have real hard data that we can share with the DFT and say, yes, you have to make helmets legal. No, you don't have pavement riding. And that's just much easier when we're doing it as a trial and involved in it. Next slide, please. And this is my last one because I've talked for far too long. These are some of the challenges we perceive about how that prevent us increasing active travel even more. And these won't be new to you. For lots of very good reasons. There's a real entrenched belief that the car is king. And there's nothing to gain by telling them that it's not. For lots of people it is, and it will remain so. The only way we're going to change that is provide them with affordable, reliable, frequent alternatives that work in a rural county. So we're going to need to be creative. We can't have the number 70 bus going around empty every day, every Sunday, because it only goes every 2 hours. Well, of course it's not going to fill up. We need not necessarily bespoke, but more customised solutions. Perhaps it's a minibus, perhaps it's more of a dial-a-ride service, perhaps we make better use of community transport. But we do need to be quite brave about it because people don't like change, and if we are taking road space or threatening the perceived right to drive, no one's ever going to accept that. So we have to take them with us, and we're going to be doing a lot of work on behaviour change because we can't just tell. Everybody knows that. But what's interesting is I'm also part of the Essex Climate Commission, and they recently did an Ipsos Mori style poll of Essex residents and asked them about their behaviours in terms of the climate agenda and how to be more environmentally sustainable and what is stopping them and things like that. And what was interesting, but perhaps not surprising, is by and large people are coming round to recycling and not supportive of food waste, but absolutely the hardest thing to convince people to change is around transport. So it's going to be a challenge. And budgets, let's be honest, is also key. I mean, my budget for the whole county and everything we do is £1 million for the entire year. One cycling route for 2 miles takes up half of that. So we're very reliant on the DFT. But what's good is because we're doing quite bold and aspirational things, they're starting to pay attention. Years ago, Essex was not on their radar as an active travel or a walking and cycling county. Now it is. And so when we contact them and say, right, these are the schemes we want to do in Braintree, in Basildon, whatever it is, they're starting to really take notice, and we have to ride that, I think. I think I did have one last slide, actually, apologies. And this is just on the Climate Commission, just further what Essex is doing. So I lead the Transport Work Stream on that. The entire Climate Commission came out with about 150 recommendations of what Essex County Council can do to meet its net zero carbon targets. These are not all the transport ones, there's considerably more than these, but I pulled out the sustainable transport ones because this is interesting because it shows that external commissioners, so the Climate Commission wasn't a council initiative. I led the steering group which supported the external commissioners. They were academics, business people, and these are their recommendations back to council about what we need to do to meet our net zero targets. And what was really uplifting with all of these is the most popular, because we then asked the entire commission group of about 70 people, all of whom are well-informed people on these topics, to vote on which they thought were the most impactful. They said walking and cycling, improving passenger transport, and behaviour change. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. That was really enlightening, actually. It was very interesting to see what Essex are doing, and I can see you've got your hands full. I'd like to open it up for questions. I do just have one quick question myself. With regards to cycling lanes and the change from the average white lines, what changes are there in a cycling lane in the visually and with the structure or whatever? What are the criteria?
So I will ask Chris to come in here as well because he knows LTN far more than I. But if you are having a one-way cycling lane or cycleway, it needs to be a minimum of 2 metres wide, and that is to allow for non-standard cycles. So that might be parents or carers with a trailer, or it might be a tricycle. If you have narrower, those are excluded, and you also can't have people overtaking. So first and foremost, it has to be a minimum of 2 metres.
Right.
And then there is this key point about segregation. And there's lots of different ways that can be done. It could be from lane defenders, which are those coloured poles into the road. It can be a low sort of curb style piece of infrastructure. I don't actually think they really say what the segregation should be. It's to clearly delineate cycle from pedestrian and motor vehicles, but can't be a white line because the white line, or just painted, it doesn't give any safety. The segregation is about safety, really, and giving people enough space to cycle safely.
So a two-way lane is going to be 4 metres?
A two-way lane, I believe, is between 4 and 5.
Can be. It depends on usage. So one thing's really interesting, LTM 120, it gives you, so that's the design guidance that comes from DFT. It gives you an opportunity to look, particularly when you're looking at the highway, within the highway you can start to look at speed and volume of traffic, and then that allows you then to start to determine the type of segregation as Tracy's referred to. So when you've got really low speeds and really low volumes, so on some residential streets, there's nothing to say you can't encourage cycles, particularly to mix with traffic. You know, if you've got low volumes, low speed, it's a safe environment for people to cycle. As that speed and volume increases, the level of segregation then starts to increase. So when you hit high speeds and high volumes, That's when that full segregation, you want a fully segregated cycle track. That's often with a sort of a metre buffer between the carriageway and the cycle tracks. You start to look at the amount of space required. It starts to be quite significant, and that's where we have that challenge about how do we find that space in a historic highway network, in particularly in some of our historic towns. When you're starting to create that segregation, it's really challenging, and that's where we're kind of looking to be ambitious and bold, and it could be that we have to start reallocating some road space to that. But yeah, the widths of cycle lanes are very dependent on usage, and what you often look at is the sort of propensity to cycle, so how many people you expect to be cycling on a piece of network, and you can determine the width according to that.
Thank you, Chris.
Pleasure.
Well, as that was quite a long presentation, I think we'll break it up. Do you want to ask Tracy questions now, members? And then we'll ask Chris to do his presentation. So do you have any questions for Tracy?
What I'd quite like to do, and I'll do it whenever you tell me I can, is to make a comment about my own starting out bike riding at a very advanced age with no help whatsoever from Braintree District Council lady who advertised in the newspaper that she was going to be helping people start cycle training. So that I haven't been able to do.
Okay, not right now, but if you've got any specific questions for Tracy on her presentation, that would be helpful.
Yeah, all right, just one, okay. How much trouble are e-scooters for the environment?
They are a net zero form of transport. So the transport aspect is not damaging at all.
No emissions?
No emissions. There is the question about batteries, which is a much more complex issue around a bigger environmental question that's probably beyond my scientific knowledge, but I know that Spin, the company that operate in Essex, do a lot of work to make sure that they're not being overcharged, so there's not fossil fuels being used when they don't need to. It's a bit like when we take our phones home. Does everybody just automatically put it on to charge as part of habit, whether it needs it or not? So there's things around that. There's also how Spin, for example, keep the programme operational. So they now only use electric vehicles and cargo bikes to distribute the scooters. So like with Boris bikes, you often end up with slightly more by a bus station and slightly less in residential areas at the start of the day, so they need redistributing. Okay. So Spin are doing a lot on mitigating that. The battery thing, I think, will be improvements in the technology and how batteries are manufactured and how the minerals are mined, that I think is perhaps a bit bigger than us. And then there's the storage of batteries when they're done. But I can get you information on the specific emissions around the batteries if that's interesting.
It's interesting, but I don't really know if that's relevant to our scrutiny review.
It's more on the kind of batteries. I would appreciate something about the kind of batteries that you are envisaging using for e-scooters.
Councillor Kilmartin, that actually goes outside the scope of the
Scrutiny
review.
It's more a climate change issue.
Kilmartin may have interest in the environmental side of e-scooters themselves. This is not the forum to obtain that information, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Would you like to raise your hands? I think Councillor Wright, you were about to.
I think one of my questions just got answered about how they got picked up the scooters, and you just answered that question. But I imagine one of the other problems you've got is you said you had £1 million budget. I imagine you could probably use more of the 338 million the government is spending on the whole of the cycle network in Essex.
I would
Because-
love the entire
No,
government's
I mean,
active travel
£1 million,
budget.
as you said, probably get you about 3 or 4 miles. You need half of that budget of 338 million to effectively make cycleways and scooterways, whatever, walkways in Essex.
I've just
And I
asked
think
for 50
unless
million.
unless the government start putting more money, I mean, they're spending £1 billion on the A12 and 338 million over the whole country for cycleways, and I think we're going to be pushing water uphill with a nose.
Thank you, Councillor Wright.
May I respond?
Oh yes,
to
okay,
that?
please.
Thank you. So the funding is a challenge, and that's another reason why we have to look at things differently. So it may be that the solutions don't fall solely within central government. It may be that we look at partnerships with businesses, and that can help the funding. It may be that we look at developing an income stream around active travel ourselves that can then subsidise other aspects of active travel.
I say that, I mean, Highways England are spending quite a lot of money on cycleways and horse riding around the new A12, which is going to be helpful. They are spending money on it, which is not coming out your budget, I take it. So, that is a help. But it's still, the majority of that money is still going into car use.
Thank you, Councillor Wright. Councillor Hensman, you have a question.
Yeah, I'll bring it back on to theme of community, and interesting to see that you only have 14 because we've got the month-long trial here, and it's about how you engage with the community. Because, for example, I would be interested in taking one of these, but my average day is a short walk down to the railway station, the train ride, and then a short walk at the other end, and it's the hill. It's downhill going. It's tiring going uphill the other way, and what would I do with it where the dump and run model is easier, whereas I'd have to take it with me to the other end and continue my journey and then come back wholly within the Braintree district, I might add, so I'm not going outside but the county or the district even. But it's what to do, because I couldn't just store it at the station and expect it to be there when I get back if I've got it on a month's trial.
No one else would be able to use it. It's locked, and it's locked to your account. So they're heavy, and they make a noise when they're, and it's not a nice noise, when they're moved and not unlocked at the same time. So it would be very difficult when left at the station for somebody else to take use of it.
I think if people came in from elsewhere and think, oh, there's one, I'll try and use it, and actually you suddenly go into Braintree and it's like you have to get it for a month, and I think you have to do a training course and something else to be able to get your helmet and insurance and so on, and then not sure, but it's equally the barriers with that is fitness, because at least me walking to and from the station each day, I'm actively doing something, whereas if the scooter's doing it for me, then it's not doing my health any good, even though I'm not emitting anything into the atmosphere. I still think there's the fitness side of it, so if it was pedalable, if that was some way of making you work and recharge the battery at the same time, and then when you get tired you can use what little charge you put in going down the hill to go slightly up the hill. So it's just interesting for the community engagement as to how how we could try and push it to the masses.
I will feed your points back to Spin. Maybe it's an e-bike that works better for you.
Thank you, Councillor Hensman, and thank you, Tracy, for that. It was really good presentation, really enlightening. So I'd like to move on and ask Chris Radley, please, for your presentation now. Would that be okay?
Thank you. Just wait for the slides to come up. What we'll do tonight, I know that you've had some previous conversations with BDC officers around this agenda, and I understand there were some questions that came about, particularly around how Essex as a highway authority came to some decisions around some of the cycling infrastructure and cycling measures that we introduce around the county. So Tracy's alluded to some of the strategic some of the strategic planning that we've done. What I thought I'd do is do a quick introduction to myself, some of the work that we're doing, but also sort of talk you through that pipeline of how we've gone from strategic planning through to delivery on the ground. This applies to across the whole county, but you'll see how we've got this long-term process. And we talked earlier on about this sort of change takes time. This strategic planning through to the actual delivery takes a long time too. So I'll talk you through that, and then I'll be more than happy to sort of take some questions at the end. Bless you. So next slide, please. So as a quick introduction, Chris Radley, or if we go back to the one before, sorry, yeah, Chris Radley, I'm the Essex Cycling Strategy leader. My role, the objectives of my role are to get more people cycling in Essex and to kind of encourage this kind of cultural shift. Tracy's alluded to it, this idea of we want people to have the choice, but we also need to do that behavioural change work about encouraging people to think differently about how they travel and to consider active modes wherever they can and wherever they're feasible. I work across the whole of the county council, so I work across the Essex Highways framework. So I work with Ringway Jacobs, I work with Jacobs, I work with Essex County Council colleagues. I work across all different departments as well within Essex. I work with health colleagues, place shaping, asset management, strategic development, strategic planning, trying to get this cultural shift within the county council as well to make sure that, as Tracy alluded to, this idea that safer, greener, healthier is at the heart of everything that we do. I also work with local authorities, districts and boroughs. I work with campaign groups, advocates, members of the public, anybody who's got an interest in cycling. So it's a really broad scope. We've been doing some really good work over the last 4 or 5 years, and as Tracy mentioned, we've seen this kind of big change now. Essex is seen as one of the sort of leading authorities now in walking and cycling. Obviously, we want to be the champion of authorities. We want to be the best, and that's something that we continue to strive towards. Another part of my role is kind of advocacy work and influencing. And Councillor Wright, you mentioned the idea of Highways England and the work they're doing around the strategic road network, particularly around the A12. So we're working with them to try and help identify some of the kind of severance points within the cycling and walking networks, and working with the Highways England to try and ensure that their plans and schemes incorporate active modes, particularly cycling and walking and horse riding. And also work with, as I mentioned, about part of the asset management team, trying to work with them around maintenance of the network. So we have got a network in Essex. It's pretty good. It's not quite up to standard. Actually, is of quite a poor standard with regard to maintenance in some areas. So we're working hard, trying to understand the asset as it stands, but also how much it would cost to kind of maintain that going forward. So it's a really big piece of work behind the scenes in relation to that. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the pipeline, and this is just kind of in a sort of headline form. And what I'll do is I'll talk you through each of those stages so you can start to see how we get to this idea of the capital programme and what actually goes in on the ground. If you could go to the next slide, please. Tracy's mentioned the DFT's bold vision around active travel and their gear change document and LTM 120. Obviously, there's funding coming through this process, and what we're finding is that the DFT are really serious about this agenda, and the COVID situation and the pandemic last year kind of created this groundswell of interest in active modes because it presents this really a unique opportunity to explore what the possibilities are and what the art of the possible would be. And in a way, it kind of turbocharged what we were already doing. We were already starting to make these plans around active travel and encouraging people to think differently. The pandemic and lockdown opportunities created allowed us to start to explore that in a little bit more detail. The results of that were the Emergency Active Travel Fund and the Active Travel Fund 2. There have been some quite significant changes in the statistics around cycling. We know bike sales were up 40% last year, and if anybody's tried getting a bike in the last 18 months, you'll know that the sort of lead times to get new bikes is quite challenging. It's quite a long lead time. So we've seen this big increase in people wanting to buy bikes. And we've also seen it's about a 46% increase in the number of people cycling on the roads in 2020 compared to 2019. So the pandemic kind of created this groundswell, as I mentioned. The DfT responded, had an opportunity to do some quite radical changes, but it was very much at a fast, rapid pace. We've seen a document come out this year, is a review of the sort of gear change 1 year on. And one of the key elements that's come from that is this idea that speed wasn't necessarily the right thing. As we've talked about, quality is key. We've talked about those principles and best practice design. Actually, that is the most important thing. This rapid response was great at the time, but actually for longevity, it hasn't been the most appropriate way forward. I think the other sort of important thing to note is the £2 billion that's still a key target for the government at the moment. There's a spending review later this year. That will potentially be the biggest sort of source of funding for active travel we've ever seen. I saw a presentation recently, and they were saying that that's 80 times more than the funding that was available for active travel in 2005. So we've seen a huge ramp up in the level of funding that's available for this agenda. So that shows the government's kind of commitment to it, and obviously Essex as an authority is keen to kind of follow that lead, and we're doing everything that we can to encourage that. Go to the next slide, please. So we'll go through the pipeline now and just talk you through how we get from a strategic plan to making sure that we're in the right place for the DfT to secure that money to actually deliver something on the ground. We've talked a couple of times and mentioned the Essex cycling strategy and the Braintree cycling strategy. These are really important documents, and for me in my role, it sort of sets out my objectives and the work that we do as an authority around cycling. And what's been really good is the partnership working between Essex and Braintree to help. We've helped sort of influence and develop the Braintree cycling strategy to make sure it aligns to the work that we're doing from a county perspective, but also sort of to share lessons learned and to sort of make sure that the Braintree cycling strategy is kind of an evolution of what we've already developed in Essex. The objectives, it's kind of they're very similar and they reflect each other. We talk about coherent networks, talk about transformational funding, best practice design, behavioural change, all of those key elements that when they come together, you start to see that shift in the pattern of how people travel. But what we need to do is kind of work more on the action plans and how we go about delivering all of those key elements. But Tracy's mentioned some of the really good schemes that we're doing in Essex already around behavioural change. So there's some really good elements that we can share with Braintree and then sort of obviously demonstrate what is working elsewhere in the county. Next slide, please. We've talked quite a bit about coherent networks, and this has kind of been a key element in our strategic planning particularly for securing funding with DfT. In 2017-18, Essex commissioned the production of cycling action plans. So every district and borough had a cycling action plan, and this was like the first layer of our planning for coherent networks. And it gave us a broad idea across the whole county of what's possible from developing a cycling network. We were able to do some prioritisation work within that. And then on the back of that, the DfT announced that they were looking to do a national programme about network development. Essex put in an expression of interest to develop local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, LCWIPs, in Colchester, Chelmsford and Braintree. We secured some technical support, and that's helped us build a really robust network using the kind of data that we hadn't really applied to network planning before. So in a way, we used it to validate the cycling action plans, but it also gave us the opportunity to develop these really key strategic corridors. So we looked at lots of data that we hadn't used before. So it's things like the propensity to cycle. What could cycling levels look like if we built really high quality cycling infrastructure? We started to look at all the trip attractors within our key areas. That was everything from schools, shopping precincts, libraries, allotments, anything and everything that would potentially be a trip attractor for a cyclist or pedestrian. And then we applied that to trip generators, so where people lived. We started to map out what these look like. So the networks that we've developed show how we should be focusing our efforts with regard to strategic planning around walking and cycling. The image there, that's just of a cycling network, but we've got another layer that gives us our core walking zones as well. This has been critical for Essex. I mean, that's been a big part in us being able to be in the conversation for funding as it's been coming through the EATF and ATF programme, but it's also putting us in a really strong position for future funding as well. So the fact that Braintree's got an LC is a really good starting point, and it gives us a really good base to start to put together some really kind of quite ambitious plans around the walking and cycling network. So that's the work that we've done, sort of developing these coherent networks, and all of this work has been done in partnership with officers from BDC as well. So we've been working with officers here to make sure that we're getting that right data locally, and that's they've been able to influence the plans that we've been developing. Next slide, please. So another key part of being able to deliver on our capital programmes is having advanced scheme designs. The current format of funding for cycling and walking infrastructure is on 1 year basis. You get 1 year to design and build cycling infrastructure or walking infrastructure. I look at Tracy, and this is a real challenge. It's really challenging to be able to do that. So one thing that we've been quite fortunate in the Essex over the last few years, we've been building up a package of advanced scheme design projects. So using those coherent networks that we've been developing, we've started to identify where we could direct design funding to allow us to start build up a package of what we know we could deliver. That puts us in a really strong position when we go to DFT to bid for funding. So that advanced scheme design programme has been invaluable, I believe, in getting us to where we are, and we continue to work on that programme. So we're always trying to be a year or two ahead of funding on the assumption that there will be funding available. So hearing from the DFT that there is still potentially more money on the table, we look forward to being able to put together some strong bids around that. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then this is another sort of part of being able to kind of deliver on that sort of pipeline is actually securing the transformational funding. There's a lot of detail that goes into the bids for the DFT. We have to demonstrate the benefit cost ratios of our programme, so looking at, investing so much money, what will the benefits be for what you're actually starting to deliver. We've got a really good team now that have built up a lot of knowledge around how you get schemes to be successful within the DFT. We've started to sort of obviously secure funding through EATF and ATF. Both of those, I believe, we were one of the highest shire counties with regard to levels of funding. So we're starting to be one of the top authorities securing money for active travel. The capability fund is sort of an anomaly in there in that that's revenue funding rather than capital. But what this is starting to show us is that the DFT is starting to bring together revenue and capital funding. So all of those fantastic behavioural change programmes that Tracy showed you earlier on, what we're hoping to do is start to build in packages that show we're going to deliver infrastructure but also deliver a behavioural change programme alongside, because we know if you build, they don't necessarily come. You need to do that behavioural change programme alongside it. We've also started to see opportunities within the local enterprise partnership, developer contributions. There's an ECC capital programme that we've started to build up around cycling and walking. There's external funding sources through organisations like Sustrans. And we mentioned earlier on that big piece of capital funding coming online, the active modes funding from the DFT. So the picture looks good. It looks good as a future. We just need to make sure as an authority and working with partners like Braintree District that we've got those plans in place, that political will, that local support to say, yes, this is what we want to do. These are the networks we want to see built. Let's take it forward as an opportunity to get some funding. And there was one slide I didn't actually have, which was around kind of the delivery side. And obviously that's the next step within that pipeline. And that's the work we're doing with ATF2 at the moment, is going through that process of getting schemes in on the ground. I think there's one more slide, if I'm right, and that's just about barriers to cycling. I understand that was one of the questions that came through the review process. I did a bit of research, actually, just before coming along sort of to this presentation, just around to see what the latest studies show around barriers to cycling. And there's a 2020 study from Savanta. And quite interestingly, the 5 key worries that are preventing people from cycling are cars, HGVs, bad road conditions, buses, and lack of cycling infrastructure. We talked earlier on about sort of the challenges ahead and what we're trying to do. Some of those we can work on and we can address. We've got a very good programme in place around trying to address those, and if they're the key issues that people are saying are preventing them from taking up active travel, particularly cycling and walking, they're the kind of things that we know we can work on. And that pipeline is certainly starting to work towards that lack of cycling infrastructure. And yeah, 34% of people surveyed said they won't cycle, often simply because it's too dangerous. Now we need to change that and do something about it. And that's where this high quality cycling infrastructure, if we follow those key 5 design principles, we make it safe, we make it coherent, direct, comfortable and attractive, that's what will encourage people to start to take up these sort of more active modes. And some old kind of barriers that we always hear about is, you don't necessarily have to be fit to cycle. It's a low impact activity. You may take your own pace. Electric bikes are fantastic now. They're starting to, not only encourage people who wouldn't necessarily have taken up cycling to take it up, but also it kind of flattens out the county. We used to look at our cycle networks as, well, if there's a hill, you have to design a route around it. But electric bikes are starting to flatten those kind of barriers out, and people are able to use that assisted pedalling to kind of overcome that as a barrier. You can't carry stuff on a bike. Well, you can. I mean, there's panniers and backpacks and all sorts of things you can do. Access to a bike is an interesting one. That's something that we know is a challenge, particularly to people who live in sort of some of our more deprived areas of the county. And one of our big projects at the moment, something that's really interesting, is a free bike programme that we're sort of piloting in Clacton and Jaywick at the moment. And through some sources of funding, we're able to actually give people bikes, and that allows them to be fit and active, to develop health and well-being, gives them access to employment and education opportunities. It's a fantastic opportunity. So we can start to overcome some of these barriers. They're not always easy, the solutions, but we can overcome them. And then the last one is choice, and we've talked about that quite a lot tonight, about this idea of being able to provide people with the choice. So we know people do struggle to sort of find the alternatives, to find those active modes, but if we can help with that choice, then that will be a fruitful future, I believe. So that's me. So thank you very much. I hope that was what we needed.
That was great, Chris. There's an awful lot of work there going into the funding and and bids, I can see. Really interesting. A quick question from me. With regards to the pilot scheme you've just mentioned in Jaywick and Clacton, has it started? How many bikes do you know have been allocated, and when will you have an outcome from I presume you're doing a study alongside this to see what the outcome is. When will that be available? So
we've literally just started giving away the free bikes. I think we're up to about 70 bikes at the moment.
Oh, right.
70. We have a waiting list of over 600 people. So over 600 people have already applied for a free bike. You have to meet a specific criteria. There's a sort of an application process. So we make sure that we check all of our applicants. We've got over 600 people applied already. And our aim for Clacton and Jaywick is to eventually give away about 1,500 bikes.
About 1,500.
Yeah. And we have conversations are underway at the moment around expanding the scheme to other parts of the county.
Where's the funding come from this?
So a large part of that came from CELEP, so the South East Local Enterprise Partnership, but also the local delivery pilot, which is being led by colleagues in Active Essex. So this project's a really good example of how we're kind of bringing together different departments within Essex County Council with a joint objective. And that was about kind of encouraging people to be active, encourage access to employment, which was one of the South East LEP's requirements. And then the local delivery pilot is about getting people active. There's a fascinating programme. We've got a really good, strong monitoring and evaluation programme in place. We've got GPS trackers on the bikes, so we can start to see who's using them, when they're using them, and that also allows us to manage the project to make sure the people who've got the bikes are using them. If they don't use them once a week, then we have a conversation and potentially come back into the programme. But yeah, it's a really exciting project, and part of our recent bid to DFT, we've put in a bid for more bikes. We really want to see this sort of scheme ramped up.
That's really good, thank you. Members, would you like to raise your hand if you have some questions for Chris, please? Councillor Wright.
Going on from the conversation just now, the bike is actually given to the person. It's not so somebody can cycle to Jaywick, leave it, and not used for a trip. It's actually given to them as their bike.
For them. Yeah, they sign a contract to say that they're willing to take that bike and they are responsible for the bike. We provide helmets, locks, all the sort of basics. But we're also starting to look at the sort of network as well within Clacton and Jaywick. So we talk about that revenue and capital balance. This project, we're actually building some new infrastructure. So a new cycle route on the seafront from Jaywick up to Clacton train station. And we're also starting to look at cycle parking infrastructure as well to sort of, and we'll use the GPS tracking to understand where people are going and then determine whether we can start introducing cycle parking. So it's a big project, but we'll have some real benefits, we believe, and we hope to be able to roll out more.
Good idea.
Thank you. Members, any other questions, please? Councillor Hensman.
Yeah, interesting with the GPS tracker, because if it's using like a GSM system, then if the bike goes walkies, you can hopefully try and get it back. But from the community engagement on recycling bikes, I know there was a scheme in Whittam. I run a community facility here in Braintree, and what usually happens is when a bike is found, the police don't take it in as lost property anymore. The finder keeps hold of it for a predetermined time, and after that, if it's not claimed, it can then be kept or donated. Or so we've got lots of frames and bits that can be cannibalised in order to make a bike from it, and it's trying to find people who are willing to take those bikes and make them into a usable vehicle. So where you're wanting bikes, I've got hundreds of frames, and it's trying to get the connection in the community, because it's also by the community for the community, which means that people can actually go and learn how to put it together, as well as then if they've got one for themselves, well, they can make another one for somebody else, and it snowballs from there. It's just trying to get that link between yourselves and projects such as ours.
Yeah, so, well, in addition to Essex Pedal Power, which is the project with the free bike giveaways in Clacton and Jaywick, we also do a lot of work with the bike kitchens. So there's a bike kitchen in Jaywick, there's one in Colchester as well. I think there used to be one in Harlow. And that's sort of almost a community-run, volunteer-run facility where people can learn about bike maintenance. And that would be a really good connection, I think, for what you've got, and we can link you into those. So by all means, drop me an email offline, and I'll put you in touch with those representatives, and we'll see if we can get something figured out. That'd be brilliant, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Any other members got any more questions at all? No? I've just got a quick one about the Savanta study. It does seem like it is the usual 5 problems, doesn't it? The cars, the HGVs, bad road conditions, buses, lack of cycling infrastructure. Do you think your funding can cover the rectification of at least some of these things? I mean, how on earth are we going to... It's a really tall order, that's what I'm trying to say. Time and time again, I mean, we do have an awful lot of potholes, like everybody else, unfortunately, because of all the changing weather conditions, and they're particularly dangerous for cyclists when they fill with water and they can't see how deep they are, and it's a little bit dark. And the cost of producing new cycleways is very high, isn't it? As you mentioned.
Yeah, it's a tall order, but I've got confidence that we're going in the right direction. I think that's the most important thing. I think from the quality of the road network, I mentioned about that work that we're doing with asset management and our colleagues in Essex Highways around trying to understand the network and where it is, particularly if it is on carriageway, where we talked earlier on about, some of our network is on residential roads and quiet streets. What we want to do is make sure that when they're being inspected, if they're inspected as a highway, they're also being inspected as a cycle route. Mm-hmm. So if there is a pothole to the side of the road, we will inspect that from a cycling perspective, not just from the car user perspective. And they do that already, but we just want to build on that piece of work and do that. So I think from that side of things, we're definitely going in the right direction. The idea of those vehicles, that goes back to that point about segregation. People feel safe when they're segregated. Yeah. Low speed, low volume, people are fine if you're cycling around a residential street. But as soon as you get into a heavy volume traffic highway where the speed is up to 30 miles an hour and over, I'm a confident cyclist. I don't necessarily like cycling on that kind of carriageway. So that goes back to that big point about creating that infrastructure that meets all of those key principles: safe, direct, coherent, and that safety element in there is often about creating segregation.
I think the delivery hubs that you mentioned, and then the change from the cargo bikes to the local deliveries is an excellent idea for some of the towns and smaller things, but for villages it will still be a problem. And it's really the HGVs I still struggle that how we're going to get round that one. But we'll crack on. Oh, Tracy, do you have an answer for that?
Essex has a very high HGV use because we are fortunate to have ports and international airports, but a lot of that freight, more than is typical across the UK, is on road. So another thing we have to do for sustainable transport, the environment and all of this is get freight onto rail. That's a really long-term aspiration, and one that honestly sits probably more with Transport East, the regional transport body, because it's more than one district. It's really more than Essex. It has to be Essex and Suffolk and Norfolk. But that's very much on our agenda. How do we actually get those vehicles off the road and reduce HGV traffic entirely?
Thank you. Councillor Kilmartin.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a basic question. If you've got an electric bike or an electric scooter, how and where do you charge it? In your front hall? Or do you have a point outside? What? Where?
Well, it depends on the model you get, but a lot of the electric bikes have removable batteries. So you can leave your bike in your shed or your garage, and you unclip the battery, you take it in, you plug it into your domestic plug, take it back out, put it back on your bike, and off you go. You just have to make sure you've got enough charge for your journey, because if you, but then, I'm sure you can find a plug somewhere, you can stop and have a coffee and charge your e-bike if you had to. But that's the majority of models have that idea where you can take the actual battery out.
And hopefully you have a garage as well, where you store it.
Not everybody does, I know that.
Exactly.
Don't most e-bikes recharge it because you're pedalling to charge the battery, and then the battery comes in if you're going uphill? Is it not?
I think they take a little bit more charge than what you can generate while you're actually riding, so they do need a charge. Yeah.
No, so you're not recharging.
No, not like a dynamo like you would get on a bike. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. One more question,
That's more of a statement than a question, because I think the big problem is the amount of funding you're going to get over the next few years to achieve a decent cycle network in Essex. Because if you only got £1 million, that's not going to go very far. And the time you achieve the cycle network, I think that's going to be too late. There's not going to be enough money to achieve what you need to achieve, even between 2030 or 2050, when you're going to try and get carbon neutral. I think it's not enough, and it's going to take too long. But it's going to be a pity. It's going to be a pity.
So the 1 million I referenced is my budget from ECC. we rely heavily on external funding, and from the Emergency Active Travel Fund, we got just over £1 million. For Active Travel 2, which we've been talking about now, we got nearly 9. We've gone from not being noticed by the DFT to, on 2 consecutive bids, being the highest shire county and the 3rd highest shire county. Budget is a challenge, but we're being noisy and we're being noticed. Still not enough. So we're going to be bigger and we're going to be noisier and we're going to be bolder. And we're going to do that internally as well, because budgets are constrained in council, but if we're going to meet the council's own net zero targets, there's going to be some difficult conversations about our budgets as well.
I think you are going to need a lot more money than you got at the moment, because I think your Essex County Council budget could be spent in Braintree District alone and not get very far.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Wright. Last, Councillor Hensman.
Yeah, just a tiny one. Seeing as HGV traffic was mentioned, it's more of a plea on behalf of the community, is that the weight restrictions for the HGVs are few and far between, because one street, literally 2 away from here, has a weight restriction at one end, but it's missing the weight restriction at the other end, and the lorries just ignore it and go through them. And equally, where you have the stop lines, they have eroded away, so cars aren't stopping properly. And where you could have a cycle box, like, for example, I know you go from Brumfield into Chelmsford, there's one on that big magic roundabout with thousands of lights. You have the extra cycle box that you can then change, because some of the road layouts are such that if you want to go straight on, it's the right-hand lane in one of the roads in Braintree, and you have to take your life in your hands to cross over. So it's not just about the cycle lanes, it's also about how you navigate the roads as a whole. So that's just a plea from me, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hensman. Councillor Weeks, did you have a question?
I'll just talk very loud. Sorry?
You've got no battery.
Oh, thank you. Yes, obviously because cycling and walking is good for your health. Do you get any funding from health authorities at all?
Active Essex, that co-funded in part Essex Pedal Power, actually sits within health. So we do have a bit. But in this latest round of funding, what's interesting is there was a request for submissions around social prescribing to understand and explore in a bit more detail the health and wellness benefits of walking and cycling. And we've put in bids for that. Now, that funding is from the DFT, but reading between the lines, the inclusion of a social prescribing pilot, I think, is likely to provide an evidence base for the Department for Health for future funding. I don't know if Chris has anything to add.
No, I think that's a really good point. I think that's kind of, we're starting to move into that sphere where we're working to try and secure funding from other departments. Yes. The Essex Pedal Power is that, and I mentioned that, that's the idea of, it's one of the first projects where we've actually brought all these different teams together, all with the same agenda, and sort of loosely through Active Essex, we've got that health element that's playing a key part in that programme. I think you're right, I think Tracy's right, that idea that there is potentially something on the horizon, and this element of ATF3 where we're doing social prescribing. And interestingly, we're already doing that through Essex Pedal Power. That is one of the elements that people can get a free bike if it is prescribed through their GP. So we're starting to do that, and it'll be really interesting to see whether there is more money through health, but definitely an opportunity.
Did you have another question, Councillor Kilmartin?
Can I give a mention again of my community branch walk?
Very quickly.
September the 18th, 11 o'clock, Whittam Station.
Okay. One just very quick question from me. I was looking. I have looked at Dutch roundabouts because we have one in Cambridge, which is I'm right up in the north of Essex and sometimes go to Cambridge. Have you got any in Essex at the moment, and how have they been going?
No.
You don't. So none at all yet.
We have none at all. We did very briefly consider it as part of actually the Braintree active travel proposal. But when we looked at it in more detail, it wasn't feasible either from a location perspective or a budgetary perspective. But it's a very interesting and important concept for future. So our designers have been to Cambridge, my team have been to Cambridge, and they've all met with the engineers and designers of the Dutch roundabout to understand what works, what doesn't, how we might implement it going forward. So no, and watch this space.
Chris?
I was going to make a plug for the Army and Navy roundabout. Actually, well, it's a fascinating. If you go, we can send the links. We can share the links. There's some really good modelling videos of what the junction could and should look like. And while it's not classed as a Dutch-style roundabout, you've got priority for active modes, and you start to see how cycling and walking should be incorporated into a highway scheme. So we're not classing it as a Dutch roundabout because it isn't necessarily, but if you start to look at how Essex is starting to develop their highway schemes, you'll see we're definitely moving in that direction. So we can certainly get those links for those YouTube videos of just that modelling of what that junction looks like, and you'll see our ambitions.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
When are you going to start doing that?
That's beyond my pay grade to say.
Okay. Right. I would like to thank you both for coming this evening, Chris and Tracy. Your presentations were very helpful to our scrutiny review, and I think we've got some valuable information from it. So I won't detain you any longer. If you would like to leave, we will continue our meeting, but I think we've taken up so much time this evening, and wouldn't like to detain you any longer.
Thank you very much, everyone, for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck as well.
Yes.
I guess your emails are first name dot surname.
Yes. Jessica has them if you need them.
Thank you very much. So thank you, members. This concludes our evidence gathering session. Based on the information gathered this evening, we now need to consider any further lines of inquiry we wish to pursue in order to inform our scrutiny review. Do members have any suggestions? Please indicate by raising your hand. It says the chat function on here, but I think it's raising your hand would be helpful. So we need to decide what direction we're going into. We can obviously look at the information we received this evening, which has been very helpful. Compare it with, on the last page of your agenda, you have the terms of reference for the scrutiny review. So they're the things that we would like to consider. And I think for the next meeting, we were considering having Councillor Ritchie for his information. And Emma, could you just explain briefly what...
Yes, Chair. Members, just to remind you, on the 20th of September, we've got the special meeting for Council for the climate strategy and for the cycling strategy. One of the things that was highlighted was, when we started to look at this scrutiny review, is the timings of how the cycling strategy and climate strategy has evolved as we started this review. So one of the things that scrutiny committee should be looking at is our policy going forward. Now, obviously, we can't bring you the cycling strategy now, as members of full council, you will have an input into the cycling strategies and the climate strategy at the meeting of full council. But obviously you are still the scrutiny committee looking at this particular element. So what we was hoping to do is our next meeting of the Community Development Committee is on the 27th of October. What we were recommending is to approach Councillor Ritchie as the cabinet member and the sponsor for those for cycling strategy to come along and to give to talk further, because you've obviously had a lot of information this evening where our colleagues at Essex County Council talk about the importance of working in partnership with the District Council, the way that funding is secured. Now, obviously, we've not seen the draft documents. You will see those probably fairly shortly when we publish the council agenda. But obviously, you're looking at that in two elements: one as a member of the District Council, and it being one of your strategies, but also as a scrutiny review where you can look at that strategy within the terms of reference, and sort of look. If you've got any questions. Now, what I need to make very clear to you is this scrutiny committee cannot make alterations to that strategy once it's been approved by full council, or if there's a subsequent adoption process. But you've got the benefit of looking at an early policy, a brand new policy, in light of the information you've had this evening. Obviously, you've had the colleagues from county saying the importance of the strategies and the council's Essex Council's own cycling strategy, and how they've worked with our officers to sort of give lessons learned and best practice, etc. So you can still look at ask Councillor Ritchie to come along to talk as the cabinet member who's responsible for that portfolio, because at the end of the day, the responsibility of this committee is not to resolve the issue on cycling and walking. It's to make recommendations to Cabinet if there are any. And it may be that you don't have any, because the emerging cycling strategy answers some of the questions that you've had evolving out of this scrutiny review. But then you look to the future to see whether there's any checks and balances you'd ask to be put in place by the Cabinet to ensure that that is an enduring document, or there's a relationship going forward. So that's what we'd like to do at the next meeting. You've had an awful lot of information given to you this evening, and when you look at your email account, I have been peppering you with emails of various links that officers have been speaking about. I've sent you some email, just some links to the website so you can have a look at some of the concepts they've talked about, and also the gear change 1 year on document, because we've already shared with you the gear change document, because that's one of your starting documents that you looked at right at the very beginning. So it's obviously important to have a look at that update document and then sort of reflect on what you have discovered today. But my reminder to you is that you're not here to fix a problem. Your role is to ask the questions, and if there is recommendations, to put those to the Cabinet. And I remind you again, the recommendations should always be evidence-based rather than be a wish list and a whim. There is ways that we can evidence things which we have on a wish list, but what we are looking at is probably moved from when the original the subject was submitted. We've always acknowledged that, and that will be acknowledged in the draft report when we prepare it. But looking at the terms of reference that we've got this evening, I've emailed you the link to the Savannah research. It's actually quite a short website page, but again, it's a credible third-party source of information. They've carried out a survey, and they've given you the highlights, and that's been reproduced faithfully in the presentation you've had this evening. And also, you've had a really good insight into the e-scooters. I know as members at full council, there's been questions been put to Councillor Cunningham regarding the use of e-scooters and etc. And again, you've had an officer's explanation, which I think has broadened your knowledge on that subject, and I have sent you the link to Spin, which is the company that was referred to by Chris and Tracy this evening, so you get an idea of how they are promoted in the wider community, not just through our own promotions and how they work. And there's hopefully a nice little plan on their website to show where those zones are for e-scooters as well. Having a look at the county's website, while I've been talking, there appears to be some little bit of an update since we last looked at it from a resource. So what Jess and I will do is just reflect on what we've already provided for you and then see any changes, because one of the things that have come through the scrutinies today is the accessibility of information. What I think members have discovered to date is there's an awful lot of information, and it's about making it accessible, and how this committee may make a recommendation about linking that information through our own websites and our strategies going forward. But obviously our strategy is still an unknown creature at the moment. We did have that point of looking at the Dutch roundabouts, but I think tonight it's been very useful to know that that has been a discontinued feasibility because of the limitations of the finances and the physical features of where it's going to go in. But we will, of course, share with you the YouTube channel videos when we get them, because I think it's always useful just from a member knowledge base, because scrutiny is not just always about holding the Cabinet to account, it's also an opportunity to learn and obtain more information, and it may be that we make a recommendation that some of those information is shared more broadly with members across the organisation, because it's always worth improving our knowledge on these things, because we will hear these things as we work in partnership with the County Council, Harbour Authorities, DFTs going forward. So we've actually covered a huge amount of our terms of reference, which I'm really pleased to say, and I think tonight you've had an awful lot of points addressed in Tracy and Chris's presentation. The biggest point on our terms of reference is the policies and criteria for walking and cycling going forward, and that will be the strategy that goes to full council in a few weeks' time. But as I said, you can still reflect upon that policy as a scrutiny review, and it may be the recommendation of the committee will be, we've got a strategy, and actually it's premature to make a recommendation, but we would welcome this to be a subject that is revisited at a later date, or ask Cabinet what the review mechanisms are if they are not clear in the strategy. But I would pretty much anticipate any revision mechanism will be already part of the overall strategy, because this will be an enduring document for the organisation as part of the overall climate strategy, and to meet those targets that all organisations have got going forward. Planning policy, you've spoken to a number of officers, and you've had a number of documentation shared. You've had quite an in-depth conversation with the lovely Neil Jones around 106s and how we use that money going forward. So I think the bit that just remains outstanding is having Councillor Ritchie in his capacity as Cabinet member to come to the committee after the strategy has been considered by full council. It would be unfair and premature to do it obviously before full council, but just because you are considered as full council members doesn't prevent you from scrutinising as part of the committee. This is part of the checks and balances of the organisation going forward. We will review what we've given you. Obviously, members, your support and input in reviewing what you've received from us over a period of time, because at the end of the day, it is your report, it is your review, these are your recommendations. So if you feel that that we've not bottomed out something, or we need to sort of maybe go down a line of inquiry that we've not yet gone, please let us know and we'll arrange it. The target for completion is March of next year. Normally we get to Christmas and we've concluded the review, and we then use our final weeks to pull the report together. So really, being the 1st of September today, there's not actually a lot of time, as we know when we look at our diaries. So if members can help officers to identify any further issues that you want to have a look down. Obviously, I will always draw you back to the terms of reference rather than just going down a point of general interest. There's other ways that we can help you to find out that information. So we wait to hear from you going forward. Is that okay, Chairman?
That's great, Emma. Thank you for explaining that in such detail. Yes, should you have any further lines of inquiry, please let governance officers know during the meantime. But I've drawn your, Emma and myself have drawn your attention to the terms of reference, because it's what seemed on the surface to be quite a nice little subject about cycling and walking has in fact become very in-depth, and it can grow arms and legs in all sorts of different directions if we don't keep to those terms of reference and actually look at the things that we've agreed to look at, because it could go on forever, as you've heard. So with that in mind, I don't believe we have any urgent business this evening, and I think this concludes our business for this evening, so I'll therefore close the meeting of the Community Development Group Scrutiny Committee, and thank you members for your attendance this evening, and to those watching the broadcast via the Council's YouTube channel. Good night.
Thank you very much, Chairman.